The diner sat on the corner of a quiet street, its big glass windows letting in the warm light of the rising sun. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, mixing with the sound of clinking cups and the soft hum of conversation. It was the kind of place where people came every morning, not just for food but for comfort. Some were regulars who knew each other's names. Others were strangers passing through, but everyone seemed to share the same peace inside those four walls. In a booth near the back, a man sat alone. He was a black homeless veteran, his clothes old and worn, his shoes scuffed, and his jacket faded from years of weather. His hands were rough, and his face carried lines that told stories of battles fought both overseas and here at home. He looked tired, but there was a quiet strength about him, as if he had carried heavier burdens before and still stood tall. He didn't have much money, but the staff at the diner had seen him before. Sometimes he would order the cheapest thing on the menu, just a cup of coffee, and sit for hours, grateful for the warmth and a place where no one judged him too harshly. This morning was no different. His hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, and for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to feel a small sense of peace. At nearby tables, people chatted about their day. A pair of construction workers talked about the job site they were headed to. An older couple shared a newspaper, their quiet laughter echoing softly across the diner. A group of students huddled in a corner, books and laptops spread out preparing for a test. The veteran noticed all of this in silence, his eyes scanning the room not out of suspicion but habit. Once a soldier, always a soldier. He had trained himself to observe his surroundings, to notice details others missed. For a moment he closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to memories of another life. He remembered the sound of boots on gravel, the roar of helicopters, the heavy pack on his shoulders as he marched under the scorching sun. He remembered the camaraderie of brothers in arms, men who had stood beside him in the darkest of times. Some of them never made it back. Those memories always came to him in quiet moments, reminding him of who he was and what he had endured. The veteran was not just any man sitting alone in a diner. He had once been someone who defended his country with everything he had. Yet now, here he was, alone, homeless, with nothing but a cup of coffee to keep him company. The world had a strange way of forgetting its heroes. Still, he didn't complain. He didn't ask for pity. Instead, he carried himself with dignity. His eyes were calm, and there was a stillness in him that made people glance twice. He didn't look broken, even though life had been unkind. He looked like a man who had seen enough to know that silence could be stronger than words. A waitress passed by and offered him a kind smile. She always treated him with respect, never looking down on him, never questioning why he came in with so little. He nodded back, appreciating the small kindness. It reminded him that not all people were cruel, that there was still warmth in the world even when life was cold. The veteran took another sip of his coffee, savoring it slowly. He didn't rush. For him, this cup was not just a drink. It was a pause in a world that often left no space for him. Here he could sit quietly, gather his thoughts, and feel human again. The sun climbed higher outside, and the diner filled with more people. The doorbell jingled each time someone walked in. He stayed where he was, blending into the background. To most, he was invisible, just another man who had seen better days. But inside he carried stories of bravery, loyalty, and sacrifice that no one could see. What made this morning different, though, was the tension in the air that he didn't yet notice. The peaceful atmosphere, the chatter, the clinking dishes, all of it was about to change. For now, though, it was still ordinary. An ordinary morning for most, but for him, it was a rare chance to feel calm, even if only for a little while. He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded him of smoke curling in the sky. Small details like this fascinated him now, the little things people often overlooked. Perhaps it was because he had lived through days when nothing was small, when every second was a fight for survival. To him, this calm moment was precious, even sacred. In the background, the jukebox played a soft tune, something old and familiar. The melody carried him further into thought, reminding him of days long gone. He thought of the home he once had, the family that used to gather around him, the respect he once held in the eyes of strangers. Now all of that seemed like another lifetime, but even as those memories weighed heavy, he didn't let bitterness consume him. He had learned long ago that bitterness could eat a man alive. So he sat there, quiet, steady, and composed. An invisible figure in a busy world, holding on to his dignity in the only way he knew how, by enduring. The morning stretched on, calm and ordinary, until the sound of the door opening once again would shatter the peace he had found. The door of the diner swung open with a sharp jingle of the bell. A rush of cool air entered with it, cutting through the warm comfort of the room. Conversations faltered for a moment as two uniformed police officers stepped inside. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere, though no one spoke of it. It was the kind of silence that comes when authority walks into an ordinary space. The first officer was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. His partner, shorter but stockier, had a restless energy, his eyes darting quickly around the room as if searching for something out of place. Together they looked like men who believed the world belonged to them, and everyone else had to prove they deserved a spot in it. The clinking of forks and spoons resumed as customers tried to go back to their meals. But the veteran noticed them immediately. His instincts, sharpened by years of service, alerted him before his mind even had time to process. Soldiers always recognized tension before it fully arrived. He did not move, though. He simply lifted his cup and took another sip, calm as ever while watching the officers from the corner of his eye. The officers walked with heavy boots that echoed on the diner's tiled floor. They didn't seem to be here for food. Their pace was too deliberate, their eyes too sharp, scanning every table as if they were hunting. When their gaze landed on the veteran in the corner booth, their expressions shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. A spark of judgment, maybe suspicion, maybe disdain. The taller officer leaned slightly toward his partner and muttered something under his breath. A faint smirk appeared on the partner's face. They shared the look of men who believed they had already found their target. The veteran kept his composure. He had seen that look before, back in basic training when officers sized up new recruits, back in foreign streets when strangers judged him by the uniform he wore, and later in America, when people only saw his ragged clothes and forgot the man beneath them. The officers moved closer to his table. The customers nearby grew quieter, trying not to be obvious, but their eyes followed every step. The waitress, who had been refilling a cup of coffee at another booth, froze for a moment, then continued her task nervously, pretending not to notice. She knew trouble was brewing, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. The veteran placed his cup down gently, folding his hands in front of him on the table. He did not want to cause a scene. He did not want to be the center of attention. Yet here he was, the quiet man in the back booth suddenly becoming the focus of two officers who had decided he did not belong. The taller officer was the first to speak, his tone carrying authority but not kindness. "Morning," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked the veteran up and down. "You planning on ordering more than just coffee, or are you here to loiter?" The words carried weight, sharp enough to slice through the room's fragile peace. A few customers looked down at their plates, unwilling to meet the veteran's eyes, afraid of becoming part of the unfolding drama. The veteran didn't flinch. He had faced men who shouted louder, men who held real weapons pointed at him. Compared to that, this was nothing. "I paid for my coffee," the veteran replied softly, his voice even and steady. "I'm not bothering anyone." The shorter officer let out a small laugh, a sound filled with mockery. "Not bothering anyone? Sitting here all morning, taking up space, making the place look bad? Yeah, I'd call that bothering people." The veteran's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his calm. He would not let anger take control. He had learned long ago that patience often outlasted aggression. Still, he could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. The customers, the waitress, even the cook behind the counter, they were all watching, silently hoping the situation would not get worse, yet fearing it would. The taller officer stepped closer, placing one hand on the edge of the veteran's table. His shadow fell across the mug of coffee, blocking the light. "We're giving you a choice," he said. "Finish up and leave, or we'll escort you out." "Your call." For a moment, the veteran stared into his cup, the steam rising slowly like a signal of quiet defiance. He didn't move. He didn't argue. He simply breathed in deeply, his mind already calculating. He had been in situations where silence was more powerful than words, but he also knew when silence had to end. The diner was silent again. The jukebox had gone still. Even the clatter from the kitchen seemed to have stopped. It was as if the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The officers thought they were in control. They thought this was just another homeless man they could push around without consequence. What they didn't know was that the man before them carried a history deeper than they could ever imagine, and a connection that would turn this moment upside down. The veteran finally lifted his eyes, calm and steady, and looked directly at the officers. His face was unreadable, but inside him a decision had been made. The morning was no longer ordinary. The peace of the diner had been shattered, and something far greater was about to begin. The tension inside the diner thickened like smoke. The air no longer carried the warmth of coffee and pancakes. It felt heavier now, like the weight of an approaching storm. Every eye, though trying to look away, was fixed on the back booth where the veteran sat across from the two officers. Conversations had stopped. Forks no longer clinked against plates. The quiet hum that made the diner feel alive was gone. The taller officer leaned in closer, his badge gleaming under the diner's yellow lights. His voice, sharp and unkind, cut through the silence. "I said you've had enough time here. Pack it up. You don't get to just sit around all day." The veteran sat steady, his posture calm but firm. He didn't blink, didn't tremble. His voice, low but clear, carried across the room. "I bought my coffee. I've done nothing wrong. I have the same right to sit here as anyone else." That calm reply seemed to irritate the officers even more. The shorter one let out a laugh, shaking his head. "Same right?" he repeated mockingly. "Look at you. You don't belong here. People don't want to eat their breakfast while you're sitting around looking like—" The man stopped, but his meaning was clear. His words stung the air, and a few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The veteran didn't rise to the insult. He didn't have to. He had survived insults harsher than this, in places far more dangerous than a quiet diner. But the taller officer wasn't finished. He tapped the table with his knuckles, his eyes narrowing. "We're not asking you anymore," he said. "We're telling you. Finish your drink and leave." The waitress, still holding her coffee pot, stepped forward nervously. Her voice wavered, but she tried to defend him. "He's not hurting anyone," she said softly. "He paid for his coffee. He's allowed to sit." The officer turned toward her, his glare sharp enough to silence her instantly. "Stay out of this," he ordered. The waitress froze, her eyes darting back to the veteran, helpless but sympathetic. The veteran took in a deep breath. He kept his composure, though his patience was thinning. He could feel the stares of everyone in the diner pressing down on him. Some looked at him with pity, some with fear, others with quiet admiration for how calm he remained in the face of humiliation. The shorter officer leaned closer, his voice a low growl meant only for the veteran. "Get up now, or we'll drag you out." The words weren't just a threat, they were a promise. His tone made that clear. The veteran looked down at his mug of coffee. The steam had faded, leaving the liquid lukewarm. Slowly, he set the cup aside, folded his hands, and looked up at the two men towering over him. His voice, though quiet, carried strength. "You don't know who you're talking to." The taller officer smirked. "We know exactly who we're talking to. A vagrant who needs to be reminded of his place." That sentence hung in the air like a blade. Some customers gasped quietly. Others shook their heads, but no one dared speak up. The diner was trapped in a silence that felt like it might shatter at any second. The veteran's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he kept it contained, like a soldier trained to control his fire until the right moment. He had no intention of being humiliated, not today. Not after everything he had endured for the very freedoms these men took for granted. The shorter officer moved first, reaching toward the veteran's arm as if to grab him. The veteran shifted back just slightly, enough to avoid the hand, his eyes flashing with warning. "I wouldn't do that," he said evenly. His tone was so calm, so steady that it startled the officer. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the younger man's face. He withdrew his hand, but his pride wouldn't allow him to step back fully. The taller officer slammed his palm against the table, the sound startling everyone in the room. Plates rattled, coffee cups shook, and the veteran's mug tipped slightly, spilling a thin stream of dark liquid onto the table. "That's it," the officer barked. "You're coming with us." The veteran didn't move. His eyes locked on the man's with a quiet intensity that seemed to say more than words ever could. His silence was louder than shouting, more powerful than resistance. The diner felt frozen, every second stretching longer than the last. People held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The officers thought they had cornered their prey, but the veteran knew better. He had faced far greater enemies than this, men who underestimated him and paid the price. He slowly reached into his pocket. The officers tensed instantly, their hands hovering near their belts, ready for trouble. But the veteran didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he drew out a simple, worn cell phone. He placed it on the table, his fingers resting lightly on it. With calm precision, he began to dial a number. His eyes never left the officers. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout for help. He simply prepared to make a call that would turn the tide of the entire situation. The officers exchanged a glance, their confidence faltering just slightly. Something about the veteran's composure, the certainty in his movements, unsettled them. He wasn't afraid, not even a little. And men like him didn't make calls unless they knew exactly what they were doing. The confrontation was no longer about a cup of coffee or a booth in a diner. It had become something bigger, something neither officer truly understood yet, but they were about to. The diner was no longer the cozy, warm place it had been that morning. It had turned into something else, like a stage where everyone was forced to watch a scene unfold, unable to leave, unable to speak. The jukebox in the corner had gone quiet. The hum of conversation was gone, and even the clatter from the kitchen seemed to have vanished. The only sounds now were the low, tense voices of the officers and the steady breaths of the veteran sitting calmly in his booth. Every pair of eyes in the diner had shifted toward the back. People who had been laughing moments before were now frozen in silence. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Coffee cups hovered in midair, forgotten. Parents placed protective hands on their children's shoulders, urging them silently to stay quiet. The ordinary morning had been swallowed by unease. The waitress stood near the counter, gripping the handle of the coffee pot so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to help, to say something. But the warning glare from the officer earlier still burned in her mind. One wrong word could make things worse, and she knew it. So she stood there, trembling slightly, her eyes darting between the veteran and the two men looming over him. The veteran sat still, his phone on the table, his eyes steady. He hadn't yet made the call, but the mere act of placing the phone there was enough to shift the energy in the room. It was a quiet reminder that he wasn't powerless. The taller officer tried to mask his unease with anger. He glanced around the diner, noticing how everyone was watching, and he raised his voice almost as if putting on a show. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced harshly, "this man is trespassing. He refuses to leave when ordered. We are handling the situation." But his words didn't ease the tension. Instead, they made the silence heavier. No one clapped, no one nodded, no one said thank you. The customers just kept staring, their faces a mix of fear and quiet disapproval. The officer had wanted control, but what he got was judgment. The shorter officer leaned closer to the veteran, lowering his voice again, but the threat in his tone was clear enough for nearby tables to hear. "You think that phone's gonna save you? Go ahead, call whoever you want. You're still leaving." The veteran didn't flinch. He simply looked at the officer with calm, unwavering eyes. That calmness unsettled them more than shouting ever could. It was the kind of calm that came from someone who had faced far worse than two men in uniforms trying to intimidate him. A child's voice suddenly broke the silence. "Why are they bothering him, Mommy?" The words were innocent, unfiltered, but they pierced through the room like a blade. The mother quickly hushed her child, pulling him close, her face red with embarrassment and fear. But the damage was done. The question hung in the air, echoing in the minds of everyone present. Why indeed? The taller officer's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned. Not by a child, not by anyone. His glare grew harsher, and his hand twitched near his belt. Though he didn't draw anything. The veteran noticed, and so did everyone else. That small movement alone sent a ripple of unease across the diner. The cook peeked out from behind the pass-through window, his apron stained with grease, his brow furrowed with worry. He had seen fights before, arguments between drunk customers, but this was different. This was deliberate. This was targeted, and it didn't sit right with him. Still, like the others, he stayed silent, afraid of what speaking up might cost. The veteran finally broke the silence. His voice was steady, controlled, but carried enough weight that every person in the room could hear. "You should be careful," he said quietly, his gaze locked on the officers. "One wrong move can change everything. Not just for me, for you." The taller officer laughed harshly, but it was forced, the sound brittle. "Is that a threat?" he snapped. The veteran shook his head slowly. "It's a truth. That answer hung in the air, heavier than the officer's words before. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it carried power. It was the kind of statement that didn't need to be repeated because once was enough. The silence in the diner deepened. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale, their hands gripping their utensils tighter. They weren't just bystanders anymore, they were witnesses, and they knew it. The shorter officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the confidence in his smirk beginning to falter. He could feel the room pressing against him now, not with words, but with eyes, dozens of eyes that saw everything. If this ended badly, it wouldn't just be between them and the veteran. It would be a story that spread far beyond the diner's walls. The veteran lifted his phone slowly, pressing one button with deliberate calm. The faint beep of the device sounded louder than it should have, echoing in the silence. He placed the phone against his ear, his other hand resting lightly on the table. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He just spoke, his words measured and clear. "This is Sergeant Williams," he said into the phone, his tone firm but steady. "I need to report an incident." 2 officers, badge numbers. The taller officer stiffened, his eyes widening slightly. The veteran's calm, professional tone wasn't that of a homeless man making a desperate plea. It was the voice of a soldier, a man with authority, a man who knew the system and how to use it. The silence in the diner turned into something else. Anticipation. The customers leaned forward slightly as though waiting for the next move in a game that was no longer predictable. The veteran continued speaking softly into the phone, his eyes never leaving the officers. And in that moment, everyone in the diner understood. The balance of power had shifted. The phone call ended with a calm click. The veteran placed the device back on the table, folding his hands together as though nothing unusual had just happened. His face was steady, his shoulders relaxed, and his breathing even. He looked less like a man under attack and more like a man waiting patiently for something inevitable. The officers, however, did not share his calm. The taller one shifted uneasily, his jaw clenched as if trying to hold on to control. The shorter one glanced at the phone still resting on the table, a flicker of doubt passing through his eyes. They had expected shouting, begging, maybe even fear, but not this, not silence, not composure. The diner was still hushed. No one dared speak, but inside, every person sitting at every booth could feel the shift in power. The officers no longer seemed untouchable. Their confidence, so sharp when they walked in, had begun to crack, and the man they thought was powerless sat unmoved, unbothered, almost untouchable. The waitress, who had been holding her breath, let out a slow exhale. She saw something in the veteran's posture that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just calm, it was authority. The kind of authority that comes from experience, from discipline, from facing chaos and refusing to break. He wasn't reacting to the officers. They were reacting to him. The taller officer tried to regain control. He slammed his hand against the table again, harder this time, making the coffee mug rattle. "You think one phone call changes anything?" he barked. His voice was louder now, but behind the volume there was something else. Frustration, maybe even fear. The veteran raised his eyes slowly, meeting the officer's glare with a steady calm that made the room feel even smaller. "Sometimes," he replied softly. "One call is all it takes." The words weren't shouted, yet they landed like a strike. The officer shifted uneasily, while the customer's eyes widened. That kind of confidence couldn't be faked. That wasn't the voice of a man bluffing. That was the voice of someone who had walked through fire before and knew exactly how hot it burned. The shorter officer leaned closer, lowering his tone so only the veteran and those nearby could hear. "Who do you think you are?" he hissed. The veteran's lips curled into the faintest smile, not mocking, not arrogant, just certain. "I'm someone who's seen men like you before," he said. "Men who thought the uniform made them powerful. But real power isn't in the badge. It's in what you stand for." The shorter officer pulled back slightly, his smirk gone. He opened his mouth to reply but found no words. The truth in the veteran's voice struck harder than any insult could. The diner remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer heavy with fear. It was charged with something else, expectation. The customers weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting to see how this man, who carried himself like a soldier without a uniform, would handle the storm. The veteran reached for his coffee again, lifting the mug with a steady hand. He took a slow sip, set it back down, and leaned back against the booth. His body language spoke louder than any words. He was not going anywhere. He was not intimidated. He was in control. A man at a nearby booth whispered softly to his wife, just loud enough for the veteran to hear. He's not afraid of them. And he wasn't. Fear was a luxury he had lost years ago in deserts and jungles where life could be taken in seconds. These two officers, with their threats and loud voices, were nothing compared to the chaos he had survived. The taller officer's voice broke the silence again, though it carried less weight than before. You think you're clever. You think this little act is going to stop us? The veteran tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. This isn't an act, he said. This is who I am. And that's why you should have thought twice before you walked up to this table. The officers froze at those words. It wasn't the threat of violence. It wasn't anger. It was the unshakable confidence of a man who knew exactly what strings to pull, what lines not to cross, and what battles were worth fighting. The waitress finally moved closer again, placing the coffee pot gently on the counter. Her voice was quiet but steadier than before. He served this country, she said. You should show him respect. The words rippled through the diner. Heads nodded quietly, a few customers murmuring in agreement. The silent crowd had found its voice, and it was siding with the veteran. The shorter officer swallowed hard, glancing at his partner. Their once commanding presence had shrunk. They were outnumbered not by force but by truth. They had tried to confront a man they thought was weak, only to realize they had awakened someone stronger than they could handle. The veteran sat quietly through it all, his resolve unbroken, his dignity intact. He didn't gloat. He didn't boast. He didn't need to. His silence, his patience, and his calm were enough to expose the truth. Enough to shake the two men who had walked in thinking they could bend him. The diner was no longer silent because of fear. It was silent because everyone understood they were witnessing something powerful. The strength of a man who had nothing, yet carried himself like he owned everything that mattered. Respect, honor, and resolve. The morning had begun as ordinary. Now it was unforgettable. And it wasn't over yet. For a long moment, no one moved. The veteran sat quietly, his phone on the table like a silent weapon, his calm composure radiating more strength than any raised voice could. Across from him, the two officers shifted uncomfortably, their shoulders tense, their faces betraying cracks in the hard masks they wore. The diner, once buzzing with morning chatter, had transformed into a courtroom without walls. The customers were no longer just people eating breakfast, they were witnesses. Their eyes, their silence, their judgment filled the air, and it pressed down harder on the officers than the veteran's words ever could. The taller officer cleared his throat, trying to regain the control he felt slipping through his hands. He straightened his posture, puffed out his chest, and glanced around the room as if to remind everyone who was in uniform. But the authority he expected to see reflected back at him was gone. Instead, he saw disapproving eyes, shaking heads, and lips pressed tightly in disapproval. The shorter officer tugged at his belt nervously. His smirk, once smug, had completely disappeared. He leaned closer to his partner, whispering something only the veteran and the customers nearby could hear. They're watching us, of course they were. Every man, woman, and child in the diner had their eyes locked on this standoff. Some held their phones discreetly under the table, recording the moment in shaky silence. They knew what they were seeing was wrong, and they wanted proof. The taller officer grit his teeth. He could feel the weight of the crowd pressing against him, an invisible jury he could not silence. He had walked into this diner believing he was in charge. But now the room was slipping away, and all of it revolved around the man sitting calmly in the booth. The veteran, for his part, didn't have to move a muscle. His quiet resolve had become a force on its own, spreading through the diner like a tide. His voice, though rarely used, had been steady. His silence had been louder than the officers' threats. He wasn't fighting them. He was letting them fight themselves and lose. A man in a business suit at the counter finally spoke, his voice strong but respectful. Leave him alone. He's done nothing wrong. The words rippled through the diner like a spark to dry grass. Another customer chimed in. He paid for his coffee, same as the rest of us, and then another voice. Show him respect. He's a veteran. The officers froze. What had begun as a confrontation between two men and a quiet stranger had shifted into something much larger. Now it was them against the room. The taller officer raised his hand slightly as though to calm the crowd. This doesn't concern you, he snapped. We're handling the situation. But his words no longer carried authority. They carried desperation. The veteran leaned forward just slightly, his voice calm and cutting through the noise like steel. It concerns everyone when men in power forget what their power is for. The diner erupted with murmurs of agreement. The authority had flipped. The officers were no longer in command. They were on trial and the verdict was already forming in the eyes around them. The shorter officer glanced at the phone on the table again. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. Who did you call? The veteran's lips curved into the faintest smile. Someone who doesn't tolerate injustice, he answered simply. The words hit like a hammer. The officers didn't know if he had called a lawyer, a journalist, a superior officer, or someone higher up in the chain of command. But the certainty in his tone told them one thing. They were already in deeper trouble than they realized. The atmosphere in the diner changed again. It wasn't fear anymore. It was hope. Customers straightened in their seats, no longer shrinking away but watching with quiet pride. The waitress, who had been trembling earlier, now stood taller, her shoulders squared. Even the cook behind the counter placed down his spatula, no longer hiding but standing openly in view. The veteran had shifted the entire energy of the room without raising his voice, without standing up, without threatening a single soul. His calm had become contagious. His quiet dignity had turned strangers into allies, fear into courage, silence into resistance. The taller officer's face flushed red. His authority, once so unquestioned, was crumbling in front of him. He muttered harshly to his partner, his voice shaking now, though he tried to hide it. We need to leave now. But before they could turn away, the veteran spoke again, his tone soft but filled with finality. No, you need to stay. You need to face what you've done. The words were heavy, unshakable. They didn't sound like a request. They sounded like an order. For the first time, it wasn't the officers giving commands. It was the man they had tried to break. The silence that followed was unlike the silence before. This one wasn't born of fear. It was born of power. The kind of power that shifts the ground beneath people's feet, that rewrites the outcome before it's even spoken. The diner had changed. The officers had changed. The balance had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The veteran's phone lay on the table like a loaded weapon, quiet but powerful. The officer's eyes kept darting to it, as though the black screen might suddenly light up and seal their fate. Their confidence had shrunk into silence, and the once commanding presence of their uniforms no longer held weight in the room. The veteran sat still, his hands folded, his breathing steady. His calm was unnerving, not just to the officers but to everyone watching. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a scene. Yet somehow the entire diner revolved around him now. The taller officer leaned closer, his voice lower, but it cracked under the pressure. Who did you call? The veteran looked up at him slowly, his gaze sharp but composed. His words, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone who didn't need to explain himself, but chose to anyway. I called someone who doesn't take kindly to injustice, someone who knows exactly what men like you are capable of and what to do about it. The words sank into the air like stones dropped into still water. The ripple effect was immediate. The customers whispered. The waitress stiffened and the shorter officer swallowed hard. The taller officer tried to laugh, but it sounded hollow, forced. Yeah, and who's that supposed to be? Some lawyer? A buddy on the street? The veteran shook his head slowly and then his lips curved into the faintest smile. No, higher. The taller officer's smirk faltered. He had meant his words as mockery, but the veteran's calm reply pierced through the bravado. Higher. The word echoed in his mind like a warning. Higher meant power. Higher meant reach. Higher meant they weren't dealing with just a man in ragged clothes anymore. The veteran leaned back in the booth, his voice steady and sure. I wore this country's uniform long before either of you. I bled for it. I buried brothers for it. And when I came home, I swore I'd never let men who hide behind a badge dishonor it. The diner went silent again, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of revelation. The customers were piecing together the truth. This man wasn't just another homeless veteran pushed aside by society. He was someone who had served with honor, someone who carried connections, someone whose name still meant something in the right places. The waitress's eyes widened. She had always treated him with kindness, but now she understood why his calm had never wavered. He wasn't just holding on to dignity, he was holding on to authority. The shorter officer stammered, his voice weaker now. "You're bluffing. If you had power, you wouldn't be sitting here." The veteran turned his gaze on him, and for the first time his voice carried steel. "Don't mistake humility for weakness. I sit here because I choose to. Not because I have to." The shorter officer's face paled. The words carried no anger, no shouting, just truth. Truth that hit harder than any threat could. At that moment, the veteran's phone buzzed. The sound was faint, but in the quiet diner it roared like thunder. He picked it up calmly, pressed it to his ear, and listened. A nod, a simple, "Yes, I understand," and then he ended the call. He set the phone back on the table, his eyes fixed on the officers. "That was your captain," he said softly. "He's on his way." The taller officer blinked, his mouth opening slightly in shock. "What?" The veteran didn't flinch. "I gave him your badge numbers. He'll want to hear why you thought a man drinking coffee in peace was a threat worth harassing." The words hit harder than a punch. The color drained from the officers' faces. Around the diner, customers exchanged looks of disbelief and satisfaction. Some even allowed themselves small smiles. Justice, it seemed, had just walked in through that phone line. The taller officer tried to salvage what little pride he had left. "You expect us to believe you can just call the captain like that?" The veteran tilted his head slightly, his eyes unwavering. "You don't have to believe me. You'll see for yourself when he walks through that door." The diner erupted into whispers again. Phones that had been recording stayed fixed, capturing every second. The story was no longer contained in this diner. It was already spreading, carried by shaky hands and determined eyes that wanted the world to see. The officers stood frozen, caught between denial and the creeping realization that they had made a mistake too big to cover. They had confronted the wrong man. They had underestimated someone who looked powerless but carried more influence than they could imagine. The veteran didn't gloat. He didn't smile wide or celebrate. He just sat there quietly, sipping his coffee again as though nothing extraordinary had happened. His calm was not arrogance, it was certainty. The certainty of a man who had faced worse, survived worse, and knew exactly how this would end. The truth was no longer hidden. The veteran was no ordinary man. He was a decorated soldier with connections, with respect that reached far beyond what the officers could see. And now, with one phone call, he had pulled back the curtain on their arrogance. The taller officer finally sat down at a nearby table, his legs unsteady. The shorter one leaned against the counter, his face pale. They had walked in believing they held all the power, but power had shifted, and once shifted, it could not be taken back. The diner's silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was electric. Everyone inside knew they had just witnessed the turning point, and soon the officers would face the consequence. The diner had returned to a strange, hushed quiet, but it was not the same silence as before. It was the silence of waiting, of expectation, of a storm about to break. Every customer sat frozen in place, coffee cooling, plates untouched. All eyes fixed on the veteran and the two officers who now looked far less like men of authority and far more like men waiting for judgment. Minutes passed like hours. The veteran sat calmly, his phone back on the table, his hands folded as though this was nothing more than an ordinary morning. The taller officer tapped his fingers nervously against his thigh, his jaw tight. The shorter one shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. For the first time since walking in, they looked like men who wanted to leave but couldn't. The diner's bell jingled. The door swung open, every head turned. A man in a crisp uniform stepped inside. His presence filled the room instantly, not because he shouted, not because he forced it, but because respect seemed to follow him wherever he went. His captain's bars gleamed on his collar, and his sharp eyes swept across the diner before landing on the two officers. The officers straightened immediately, their nervousness spiking into panic. "Captain," the taller one began, but the captain raised his hand. "Not a word," he said firmly. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of weight that silenced rooms. He turned to the veteran. For the first time, the crowd saw the veteran's expression soften. The two men exchanged a look, not one of strangers, but of men who shared a deeper understanding. Respect flowed silently between them. "Sergeant," the captain said with a nod. The veteran nodded back. "Captain," the crowd gasped quietly. Whispers rippled through the room. Sergeant, Captain. The truth was undeniable now. This wasn't just a homeless man who had been cornered in a diner. This was a decorated soldier, a man with history, with rank, with honor that commanded respect from men at the highest levels. The captain turned sharply toward the two officers. His voice was calm, but every word landed like a blow. You thought it was acceptable to harass a veteran? In public, over a cup of coffee? The taller officer stammered. Sir, he looked suspicious. Suspicious? The captain's eyes narrowed. Sitting quietly in a diner drinking coffee is suspicious? The shorter officer tried to step in. We thought he was loitering. We were just doing our job. The captain's expression hardened. Your job is to protect and serve. Not to intimidate. Not to embarrass. And certainly not to dishonor the uniform you wear. The words stung and the officers wilted under his gaze. They looked smaller now, stripped of their authority, exposed before the very people they had tried to impress with their dominance. The captain turned back to the veteran. His voice softened. Sergeant, I'm sorry you had to go through this. It will be dealt with immediately. The veteran nodded, no bitterness in his eyes, just quiet dignity. I didn't call for myself, he said softly. I called because men like them need to be reminded of what the badge means, and what it doesn't. The captain nodded slowly, understanding. He turned once more to the officers, his voice sharp. Effective immediately, you're both relieved of duty. You'll report to Internal Affairs first thing tomorrow. Hand me your badges. Gasps echoed through the diner. The taller officer's face went pale. Sir, please, now. The command was final. There was no arguing with it. With trembling hands, the officers removed their badges and placed them in the captain's outstretched palm. The sound of metal hitting metal as they dropped into his hand was louder than any shout, louder than any protest. It was the sound of careers ending. The captain pocketed the badges without another word. The officers stood frozen, their shoulders slumped, their eyes fixed on the floor. They were no longer in charge, no longer feared. They were just men who had crossed a line they could never uncross. The customers in the diner, who had sat silently for so long, now broke into soft applause. It wasn't loud, it wasn't mocking, it was respectful, directed at the veteran who had faced down humiliation with dignity, and turned the tables with nothing more than patience and a single phone call. The waitress wiped at her eyes, smiling as she refilled the veteran's coffee without asking. On the house, she whispered. The veteran nodded, lifting his mug slightly in thanks, but his eyes stayed steady. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile triumphantly. He simply sat there, the same man he had been when the morning began. Quiet, dignified, unbroken. The captain gave him a firm handshake before leaving. The two disgraced officers followed, their heads low, their footsteps heavy with the weight of what they had lost. As the diner's door closed behind them, the atmosphere shifted once more. It was no longer heavy, no longer tense. It was lighter now, filled with relief, with admiration, with the sense that something important had just happened. The customers began to eat again, though many stole glances at the veteran, whispering his story to one another. They would remember this morning. They would tell others. The man in the back booth, once invisible, had become unforgettable. The veteran took another sip of his coffee, setting the mug down gently. His work here was done. He had defended himself not with fists, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of a man who knew his worth and refused to let anyone take it away. And as the sun climbed higher outside the diner's windows, the world kept moving. But for everyone who had been there that morning, things had changed. They had witnessed what real strength looked like. And the story of the veteran who made one phone call and ended two careers would never be forgotten.